All right, Immersive Programming Series, Episode 4. And in this one, we're going to take a look at what I've kind of just started to call my programming playbook. So, really, this is the intermediate phase between our intake and assessment and our testing collection, and then actually putting our programming script together. So, this will kind of be a little bit of an eclectic episode. We'll cover a little bit of a wide range of things here, but this is essentially what I see to be kind of our key pillars for our starting point for putting a program together. And for this first slide here, I actually want to start down at this bottom box. And with our programming strategies and approach with our athletes, we want to really look to provide a sense of confidence. We want to have a strategic mindset and be able to communicate these strategies to our athletes. And again, for some cases, athletes could absolutely care less about what we're doing or what the X's and O's look like. But for some of them, they do care. And I think that it's our job to kind of, match that level of input or energy, on our end based on the level of interest from the athlete. And then the last thing that I always like to make sure I'm including up front with everyone is what the expectations are as we're going through the training process. So expectations is not necessarily this like militaristic, like, hey, we have to be 10 minutes early for every session. I mean, when I say expectations, I also mean including like, making sure that you're mentioning to them when they should be more sore, when they're going to probably feel like they're getting beat up a little bit more from training versus when they should feel more recharged and refreshed. How we're going to kind of accommodate for compounding variables and things of that nature. So expectations, again, isn't, from a disciplinarian mindset, but being very clear and providing a sense of comprehension as they're getting into their training cycle. So with this, the fundamental keys for programming and tying this into what we've already discussed a little bit in the second and third episode, with the intake and assessment, we're trying to collect as much valuable information as we can in a short period of time so that we can then reverse engineer the process back from where they're trying to go versus where they are now. In addition to that, we want to make sure that we're understanding our constraints. So a lot of the programming parameters, exercise selections, and how we go about our programming style is going to be really determined for us. How much surface area or square footage you have within your facility, how many athletes you're working with at one time. Is it one-on-one or is it group? Are they high school or are they adult? How long are they going to be training for? Is this a 6-week iteration or is this a 3-month iteration? Are they training twice a week, 4 times a week? And then again, back to, what equipment we have available to us. And, if we have one-on-one versus small group versus a large group, the equipment is going to change drastically across those 3 settings. I've mentioned this in the last episode, but, again, when I'm sitting down to write somebody's program, it's not just the tangible X's and O's. Well, their measures were this, and they tested with this, this, and this. I want to make sure that I'm putting together a program that is somewhat conducive to who they are as a person. So a quick example on that is, if I have somebody who is very new to the training setting and they, kind of are more focused on how they look within the gym or how they look while they're doing something, then based off of that alone, I'm not going to put a ton of complex stuff in there. I want to make sure that I'm giving them things that are going to be, confidence builders for them as they're getting acquainted and comfortable to their new setting. Beyond that, we want to always look to our low-hanging fruit, making sure that we are providing the things that are going to have the greatest amount of turn for the least amount of investment. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a second, but, for me, this is a lot of foot and ankle stuff. This is a lot of trunk and glute stuff, abductors, adductors, areas that are just less commonly emphasized or focused on in other training settings. So with where I'm at now, working with, middle school, high school athletes, I know that most of them are training at their school with their sport coach or with their strength and conditioning coach at school. I know that they have a ton of practice and game time right now. So for me, a lot of the low-hanging fruit is just really what is not common in a typical high school weight room, what is not common or not provided in practice time. And a lot of these things, again, are, foot and ankle, calf, adductors, down regulation, adding breath work into our training program, because if I have a kid who's already doing squats, bench, dead, cleans, I don't need to double down on that. I need to fill in the gaps where they're not getting a lot of attention. And then lastly, no matter what the situation is, who we're working with or what the setting is, we've always got to be ready to audible. A program is a very fluent thing, and I've said this before, but I always see a program as being a living, breathing document. It's something that's constantly being tailored and refined based on how things are occurring. So we touched on this slide in a previous episode, about how we stratify or how we scale our athletes, and for me, I apply a color classification to that. With my previous history being so wide-reaching, I utilize this green, blue, red, gray scale really to determine the different types of populations that I was working with. But if you're just in one setting, so for instance, if you're just working with high school athletes or if you're just working with college basketball players, you can follow this exact same green, blue, red, gray scale. It's just going to be tailored or fit to your population. So rather than it being sport performance, personal training, restorative training for your general goals, this could be peak performance, this could be developmental phase, this could be foundational phase, and then this could be something like return to play or, rehabilitative type of programming. So again, this is very modifiable based on what your setting and parameters are. But for the sake of this episode, I wanted to show how that transitions right into how we determine program type, our intensity or our demand, our volume, variation and complexity, and our general goal. So, for instance, with our green classification, these are athletes that I'm most often or almost always going to be using some form of conjugate style training. It's going to be a much more demanding, high intensity type of programming. We'll have an undulating amount of volume where we're typically going to be contrasting between speed emphasis days and strength emphasis days. We'll have periodized variation or complexity into their programming. And then obviously, this is a true strength and conditioning or sport performance type of program. For my blue, I'm going to have more of a hybrid style of programming type. For red, it'll be more of a traditional linear. And then for gray, which I essentially treat as a return to play athlete, there is no program. Every day is going to be so variable and different. I don't need to really project forward too much. We just need to make sure that we're hitting on our KPIs and then adjusting appropriately as we go along. But the goal with this is always the same, right? If I have a gray athlete who's in return to play, I want to focus on getting them back to a conventional linear model with traditional programming as quickly as possible to then get them back into more of a sport-based programming and then eventually getting them back into a green classification where we have conventional strength and conditioning program. One of the biggest things that I have continued to find to be true is the importance of training parameters. And the best way that I can describe this is training parameters are everything that we've wanted exercise selection to be. If you jump on Twitter, Instagram, you'll always see the majority of the attention gravitating towards different exercise selections or variations. And, that's fine, and we can always have discussions about those things. But at the end of the day, it's really not what we're doing as much as how we're doing it. So if we look at it being separated as program structure versus session structure, the programming structure, I think idealistically. So if I'm sitting down and I'm writing out somebody's, 4-week cycle or 12-week cycle or whatever it is, I'm going to write that as if I have perfect conditions with everything going in my favor and assuming that there necessarily won't be any problems. The important caveat there is that while I am always aiming for perfect and idealistic, I understand that it will not occur that way. So I'm going to fluctuate between, what I'm aiming for in terms of perfection or idealistic modeling, and then within those boundaries or within those perfect parameters, understand that I'm going to have day-to-day and week-to-week adjustments and fluctuations. So we talked about this one too, but we can take somebody's collective medical history, injury history, training history, and have a pretty good idea of what their starting point should be and what their progression should look like. But the reality of it is that life is life. So high academic stress periods, if you're working with an adult population, family stress, work stress, things like that, those are going to skew our ability to implement the program as we see it to be best fit. So when we take these training parameters, volume, intensity, our heart rate zones, HRV ranges, frequency, training frequency, or how we're splitting the week up, the general formatting style, conjugate, linear, a hybrid, these are all things that I think are going to be loosely predictable, and we can pretty much just get to a point where we start to automate these based on the type of athlete or setting that we're working in. But we come down here, and this is where the magic really happens. So we have, our volume and intensity ranges, and we can honestly throw heart rate zones and HRV in there as well. But then we have our applied volume and intensity down here in the session structure. So this is why I'll almost always write things as, 65 to 75% or 80 to 85%, because I know that there's going to be some level of undulation as we go through. In addition, we can always implement some tempo work. We can change or modify our range of motion, the vectors we're working through, path of motions, how we're doing these things, the stance, position, where load is placed. So all of these things can be, quote unquote modifiers or tweaked throughout the programming process, but this is how we really bridge the gap between an idealistic model and what we can actually apply. Next, we want to look at what the overall pursuit or kind of theme or goal of our training is going to be, and this is just one example. We can populate these with a million different things, and honestly, it can be as simple as lacking strength versus lacking speed. It can be lacking stability versus lacking mobility. Like, these can be populated with a myriad of things, but lacking stiffness versus lacking spring is a common theme for me, and these are going to help drive those training parameters. So, we see down here, if we are lacking spring, we're going to want to just have more of a speed element or an elastic element or theme to our programming. So this is where we're going to focus more on expressing force, having our extensive plyos, and focusing on our rhythm and timing, focusing on our reactive movements, and really utilizing a lot of submaximal strength to help develop the elastic qualities. Conversely, if we're lacking stiffness or strength, this is where we're going to want to focus more on the above 80% range, a lot of time under tension, and where on the speed side we're focusing on expressing forces, the strength side is going to be more resisting forces. And then, for the plyo's sake, this is where we're going to focus more on the high intensity or the intensive plyos. So, again, it's just another kind of modifier or layer for my programming approach, where we can do a lot of the same things across different populations for different goals, but the way in which we are doing those or dressing them up is going to change the outcome, in most cases, somewhat significantly. That leads into progression-regression pathways. And if you are a young strength coach in your first, 3 to 5 years or whatever, this is something that I can't emphasize enough. This is extremely important, and something that I've noticed that young coaches tend to have a little bit of difficulty with. And I go back to my exercise selection piece, and let's take like a bench press, and we see that, an athlete is having some non-specific shoulder pain when they're going through their bench sets. What a young coach will immediately default to is dumping the weight down, and if there's still problems, they'll just scrap it all together and say, hey, okay, we're just going to go to a landmine press instead. Well, going back to my idealistic versus realistic applications, I want to try to stay as close to what I had programmed initially, because remember, that's where I'm sitting down and very focused on what is the perfect program or sequence of things that we need to do in order to achieve what they're trying to achieve. And if I wrote down bench press, I want to stay as close to that as possible. So of course we can reduce the load down. We can go with partial ranges of motion, or we can do a number of different things to essentially band-aid the situation in the short term. But we can also look to it as, how can I stay as close to this central point or this base as I can? And, if we stick with the bench press thing, my honest answer would probably be either changing the type of bar that we're using, so going to something like a Swiss bar, or just going to a dumbbell and trying to keep as close to that load mark as we possibly can. But if we look in general here at progression-regression pathways, our main factors are over here on the left. We've already mentioned it, but amount of load, the type of load. Then we have our speed of movement. So this is where, if people are having difficulty with, reactive tempos or ballistic tempos, we can adjust based off of that. We can then look to the direction of movement or the vector, the degree of complexity, how much cognition is required for them to achieve what we're trying to program, their personal background, sport background, training background. Then we have points of contact. So the points of contact I look to be, kind of our separator from intrinsic stability demand versus extrinsic stability demand, where for the novice athletes, we're going to have much more of a high degree of extrinsic stability, so essentially providing the stability for them, as opposed to a more advanced athlete, we're going to want to work more towards intrinsic stability demand. the position or stance that we're working from. So whether it's bilateral, split stance, kickstand, single leg, those are going to be factors to consider. Where we're holding the weight. So if we're having, an athlete do a split squat and they're holding a double kettlebell rack versus a suitcase, and a quick caveat there, that's also another one that is going to be modified based on injury. So if I have somebody who has quad tendonitis versus patellar tendonitis, a lot of the times where the load is positioned or held is going to be a significant factor. And then whether we're working more contralateral, ipsilateral, unilateral, etc. We also then have surface type and presence or utilization of momentum. So for the most part, we look to our regression parameters, and these are going to be a reduced load. We want to have things that are more fixed and stable in nature, reduce the speed, obviously more simplistic, emphasizing extrinsic stability. We're going to mostly be bilateral and then have a fixed or predictable type of setup. I'll touch back on momentum in a second. And then basically it's going to be the opposites for progression, where we're going to see increased load, open and unstable, higher speed, more complexity, emphasizing the intrinsic stability, working towards unilateral, and having more of a variable or unpredictable type of setup. So let's take an RDL here. If we're progressing, we remove a limb, creating a barbell single leg RDL. Then we can add accommodating resistance, increasing the speed, increasing the complexity. So we go to something like a band resisted RDL. And then we can change the vector or the complexity. With an RDL, this can be done by just having an offset setup. On the regression side, we change the load type. So they had trouble with the barbell. We dump it down to an RDL, try to keep the weight high if we can. Let's say they continue to have trouble from there. So now we're going to reduce the range of motion rather than having them go down towards, close to the ankle joint. We'll stop like at below knee. And then we can always add a constraint. So, if we're having trouble with knee control or hip position, we can always throw a band around the knees, to kind of help give them more tactile feedback on how their movement is occurring. But to quickly touch on the more or less momentum, momentum is a great tool that you can utilize to your advantage in both a progressive and a regressive sense. So let's say if I have somebody doing a step up and doing a lunge. On the step up, the momentum would actually become a regression where I'm allowing them to step forward into the box, giving them momentum going into that vertical ascension on the step up. Whereas with a lunge, increasing momentum or adding momentum would be a progression, because if I add a step preceding the lunge action, it's actually increasing the amount of speed that we're getting into the lunge pattern, which is then increasing the eccentric forces that are being experienced. So momentum is a tricky one, but it's definitely something that you want to continue to play with. And again, you can utilize it in both a progressive or regressive manner. Coming down the stretch here, the 4 key elements of training, I've talked about this one in a number of different places, but everybody always looks to the big lifts. They look to the primary blocks, and they look to the speed and sprint work and the global conditioning stuff. And all of those things are great. We've got plenty of good discussion on that. I try to look to these 4 elements to really try to build out the effectiveness of training, the efficiency of training, and then giving them some level of consistency or comfortability with how the workouts are going to be undertaken. So for the warm-up, this is an area where I don't want to just focus on just getting the body going. I want to get the brain going too. This is where we're starting to kind of get our mind right for the training session, and it's, stimulating the stimulating the system for the session that day. Intraset work is something that we can definitely utilize for the sake of efficiency. These are things that we want to pair with our primary lifts and try to address specific individual deficits for that athlete. The accessory block I've definitely talked about a lot, but this is where I'm really trying to challenge the system, adding in more of a variation focus, trying to get into some different planes, different types of resistance, and utilize some different tools. And then post-training is restoring from that day and preparing for the next one to follow. So this is where we're trying to get back online so that we can come in the next day and have a really good starting point for our subsequent training session. The recipe for autoregulatory, I touched on this one a little bit in the previous episode, but autoregulatory is what I'm always striving for, no matter who it is I'm working with or what the type of programming is. And the 3 things that I look to for an autoregulatory approach is, number 1, utilizing time blocks. This is extremely effective for efficiency. So whether I'm writing a program for something I'll be coaching in person, or if it happens to be something remote, I'm going to utilize a time block structure. Essentially, the time block removes the demand for having to program a specific amount of sets. So the rep count will be programmed, the intensity will be programmed, and then the rest range will be programmed. And then effectively what we're doing is we're trying to work through that time window, typically 16, 18, 20 minutes, and we will adjust or fluctuate the rest range as needed so that we can control the volume based on what they have for that day. So the caveat is normally, it'll never be less than 3 sets and it'll never be more than 5 sets. But, if somebody comes in on a Monday and they had a rough weekend and we had 5 times 10, so 5 sets of 10 at 65% on bench, and they're like, man, I just don't have it today. It's not in the tank. What that does is it not only, changes the demand for our programming for that day, on our end, but also it becomes almost like a confidence killer for the athlete where they feel like they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing or they missed the mark or whatever. And I just don't want to play those psychological games. So it works in the opposite way as well. Like if we had 3 sets of 10, but they came in feeling 100% that day, I don't want to be the limiting factor in their training for that day because I was presumptuous as to how much volume they'd be able to handle. So time blocks are absolutely one of the best things that I can recommend for any training purposes. The intensities are always going to be treated as implied effort. So really, I'm never testing anybody for a 1 RM. Very, very rarely will I even get 3 RMs for select measures. But, in essence, these are implied efforts. So I don't really care if your true 65% on bench is, 225 and, you came in that day and you can only hit, 6 or 7 reps at 225. I just want you to get the most out of that day. So a 65% for 10 reps is, we should finish up 8, 9, 10 and be moderately fatigued. Whereas down here, when we get to 4, 5, 6, we should feel some level of difficulty as we finish that set. So that's another one that I think has been very effective for me is kind of trying to get away from being married to specific numbers and, we have to hit this percentage or whatever for it to be a successful day. I already kind of covered it, but the rest ranges are key. Make sure that you are utilizing this as a sliding scale, and it should be something that helps to buffer your programming. It's not just this arbitrary amount of time that you tell people to sit down and, keep quiet and go get water. Like, this is something that should be a little bit more interactive. And if we don't need to take 2 minutes of rest, don't take 2 minutes of rest. If we need more than 2 minutes of rest, give it to them, right? Like, we need to get away from some of these archaic, textbook charts that we've all, regurgitated over the years. So be interactive with your rest ranges. I'll cover this one quickly, but I have always followed a training block approach. This is something that is far from original or unique in my sense. The block setup for me is a way that we can just create good architecture for how we're navigating our training days. And, essentially for block 1 with our primary lifts, we're looking for 1 to 2 movements. This is where we're going to hit our compound loading on our big movement for the day. And it's either going to have a speed, power, or high force focus. We always want to pair our primary lift with those intraset options that are, either potentiating or at least not fatiguing and non-competing to what our primary movement is for that day. Block 2 is going to be my accessory strength block. So here I'm usually going to include 2 to 3 movements. And this is where I'm going to kind of take big movements, compound loading type of approach, but doing them in more of a unilateral or a contralateral focus. So rather than just having a hex bar deadlift, we'll throw in the kickstand setup. And then I want to focus on something that's going to challenge time under tension. And again, trying to move in different vectors. Block 3 is my auxiliary work. So this is where I'm usually going to have 3 movements. And this is where I want to emphasize complexity and variation. So this is going to be minimal compound loading. We don't want a lot of redundant, unnecessary volume accumulation here. So this is where I'm going to kind of start to get a little bit more nuanced with my exercise selection. And then the last thing that I wanted to touch on here in this one is something that's a little bit newer for me, but I've just termed this to be training buckets. And, now that I've been introduced to the world that is group high school and middle school athletes, I'm starting to have a better sense of appreciation for my peers and my field when, we've seen how chaotic and unpredictable this environment can be. And I'm starting to get an understanding of that. So with that, I'm thinking about this as keeping my buckets full. So essentially, I'm going to write my programming out, whether it's for the week or if I'm writing it a couple of weeks at a time. And then I'm always going to anticipate things not going the way that I planned for them to. So this goes back to our idealistic versus realistic, and something I've added in the mix now is just having a couple of training buckets. So if we have more kids than we expected for the training session, we have, we were expecting 10, but we only got 2. So-and-so came in and sprained their ankle at PE today. Somebody comes in and forgot to tell us that they have a game tomorrow. I can always deviate left or right, flex up, flex down, and I can always add in things that are going to be conducive to the population that I'm working with. And essentially, this is just staying one step ahead of it, right? So we want things that are simple, not a lot of equipment variation or variability, not a lot of complex movements, things that can kind of be plug and play, pretty much irrespective of who we're working with. And then this is also a good way to just kind of help organize some of these more structural components of our programming. So our warm-up, our intraset, our finishers, even to include like kind of our homework list and things that we're giving kids and athletes to do on their own time. But effectively, you want to try to look to categorize and classify a couple of different things to just kind of keep in your back pocket so that you're never caught off guard. Hopefully that was another helpful installment of the Immersive Programming series for you. Real quick as we finish up here, I just wanted to take a second to mention that we have a major product coming out. This is our first flagship product set to release here in about 2 weeks on November 11th. The Fascia Chronicles, and this is a joint project between myself, Jeremy Aspa, our buddy Rob Umphris, and then my wife Nicole, who really orchestrated and coordinated this entire project start to finish. This thing is going to be a monster. It's going to be about a 10-11 hour webinar broken up into 20 to 30 minute modules with some interactive quizzes and some follow along stuff. We've got some practical documents. So this thing is going to be really great. And, we've got to give a quick shout out to Simply Faster, who's just been so great to us over the years in so many ways. But this will be exclusively released through Simply Faster. So over the next couple of weeks, make sure that you're keeping an eye out for this. And if there's any questions or if there's any more information needed in the short term, please feel free to reach out to us at any time.